Okoye stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. You are my woman henceforth, but know this. If you ever try to escape, I will kill you myself. Understand? Adaku's heart pounded as she held her sister, Choma, close. Everything had happened so fast. They had been enjoying a peaceful family gathering in the village when men with guns stormed in. There was shouting, and before they could run, the masked men grabbed them. They were thrown into the back of a van along with 5 other people. The air was tight and fear filled the van as it sped into the unknown. Choma trembled beside her, too scared to cry out loud. Adaku's only thought was to keep her sister safe. After hours of driving, the van stopped deep in the forest. The kidnappers dragged them out, and that's when Adaku saw their leader, Okoye. His face was hard, his eyes cold, and he gave orders without a hint of care. The hostages were locked away in a small, dirty cabin tied up and left in the dark. Adaku overheard their plan, ransom. They had 5 days to pay. If their families didn't come up with the money, death would be the price. The fear in the room was heavy. 2 men had already pleaded for mercy, but were met with a stern warning not to try it again. Adaku could feel the tension rising. The kidnappers weren't patient men. They would check on the hostages every few hours, counting down the days until the ransom was due. 2 prisoners had been released after their families paid, but Adaku knew her family wouldn't be able to gather the money in time. Fear gripped her every time Okoye and his men walked in. On the 3rd day, the kidnappers dragged 3 hostages outside. Adaku and Choma held each other as they watched the kidnappers slit their throats. They killed the 3 without hesitation. It was a cold reminder that these men were serious. Adaku realized she had to act fast. She couldn't let Choma die, but what could she do? Okoye was the leader, the most ruthless of them all. He was tall and intimidating, always barking orders and treating the hostages like they were nothing. The other kidnappers feared him, and it was clear why. He showed no mercy. But Adaku noticed something. Okoye's eyes would linger on her a little longer than they did on others. He wasn't immune to her beauty, even in his wickedness. Adaku thought this might be her only chance. She decided to try something risky to get Okoye to like her. Maybe, just maybe, she could get him to release Choma. That night, as Okoye walked past them, Adaku made her move. "Thank you," she whispered softly, her voice trembling but steady enough to catch his attention. Okoye paused. He looked confused. "For what?" he asked, his voice low but very rough. "For not hurting us, at least yet," Adaku said, her eyes meeting with his. It was a gamble, but she had to seem sincere. Okoye stared at her for a long moment before turning away without a word. The next day, Adaku found small ways to be noticed. She stayed quiet but smiled softly whenever Okoye was around. Later that evening, when Okoye brought them food, throwing the bread on the floor like they were some ruminant animals, Adaku seized her chance again. She stood, walking slowly towards him. "I want to thank you," she said. Okoye raised an eyebrow, but he didn't move away. "What do you want? Thank you for what again?" Adaku swallowed her fear. "For not leaving us to starve. It means a lot to us. Thank you." Her heart raised as she said those words, praying it would hit the right spot. Okoye's cold expression didn't change. He looked at her closely, studying her face. "Your beauty and politeness won't stop me from slitting your throat if we don't receive the ransom when due," he said, his voice a little softer than before. "I understand," Adaku said, holding her breath. "I just wanted to thank you." Okoye was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Our money is the only right thing we seek. Stop thanking me." Adaku's plan seemed to be working. Okoye seemed to like her a bit, at least. She could feel it even though he never showed it. The forest was silent that night, except for the low murmurs of the men around the campfire. Okoye sat on a log, deep in thought, as 2 of his men approached him. They cleared their throats. hesitating a bit before speaking. Boss, one of them began, tomorrow is the deadline. We haven't heard anything from Adaku and Choma's family about the ransom. What should we do if we don't hear from them by the deadline? Okoye remained quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. His mind was swirling with thoughts, but his face showed no emotion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at the men. Do nothing, he said flatly. We will see if the money comes, but do nothing. The next day, Adaku and Choma were summoned, their hearts raised with fear as they were led to the center of the camp, where Okoye and his men stood waiting. Adaku hugged her sister tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. They were sure their time had come. Is this it? Choma whispered, her voice shaking. Are they going to kill us? Adaku couldn't answer. All she could do was hold her sister tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. Okoye stepped forward, his expression fierce. We haven't seen any alert, he announced coldly. Your parents haven't sent the money. It's time to take you out. The words hit them like a hammer. Choma sobbed uncontrollably. The men around them prepared to take action. Adaku, filled with fear and desperation, fell to her knees in front of Okoye. Please, she begged through her tears. Take my life. Let my sister go. I will die for her. Just let her live, please. Okoye's eyes narrowed and he took a step closer. You'd really die for her? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Adaku nodded without hesitation. Yes, I would rather die for her to live. Okoye pulled out a gun. He handed it to her. If you are serious, then prove it. Kill yourself now and I'll let your sister go. Adaku's hand trembled as she took the gun, her heart racing. She glanced at her sister who had fallen to her knees, crying. No, Adaku, please, Choma cried. Let me die instead. You can't do this. Adaku smiled through her tears, her heart breaking for her sister. I love you, Choma, she whispered, raising the gun to her head. Take care of yourself, she said and pulled the trigger. There was no bullet. Nothing happened. Adaku blinked in shock, looking at the gun. Okoye chuckled darkly, crossing his arms over his chest. No bullet, he said. I wanted to see if you were really loyal, if you would truly die for your sister. Okoye waved his hand at his men. Let her sister go, he ordered. She is free, but let her go at night. Choma cried harder, hugging Adaku tightly. You did it, she whispered. You saved me. But what about you? That night, after Choma was released, Okoye called Adaku to his tent. The fire cast shadows over his face as he spoke. You, he said, his voice low. You are ready to die for your sister. I like that. I want someone who will be loyal to me like that. Someone who loves that hard. Adaku's heart pounded in her chest. Okoye stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. You are my woman henceforth, but know this. If you ever try to escape, I will kill you myself. Understand? Adaku nodded, a strange mix of emotions building inside her. She wasn't happy to be his woman, a captive at that, but she was relieved. Her sister was free, and for now, she would be kept alive. But what started as an act to save her sister slowly grew into something darker. She slowly started to like him. After every successful kidnapping operation, Okoye and his men would switch hideouts, constantly moving Adaku from one camp to another deep within the forest. It was exhausting and unsettling, but Adaku had no choice. She followed, building a cautious trust with Okoye, knowing it was her only way to survive anyway. One night, everything changed. There was an unexpected raid on one of their hideouts by the authorities. Okoye and his gang barely escaped. The entire camp had been burnt to the ground, and Okoye's thoughts were clouded with fear for the first time. He realized he couldn't keep Adaku hidden in the forest forever. There were too many risks, too many close calls. The thought of her being captured or worse, killed, terrified him more than he was willing to admit. That night, Okoye made a decision. He moved Adaku to his private residence, a mansion in the heart of the city. When they arrived, Adaku was stunned. The mansion was unlike anything she had imagined. She had heard of lavish homes, but this was something else. She couldn't help but feel sad about how Okoye and his men had stolen from innocent people to acquire such an extravagant life. But one thing, the security of the mansion was tighter than anything she had ever seen. Guards patrolled day and night, and cameras covered every inch of the property. It felt like living in a prison disguised as a palace. Escaping was an almost impossible mission. But somehow, Adaku found a strange comfort in the luxury. She was relieved to be away from the rough life in the forest, the bugs, the cold nights, the constant fear of being found. Here, she could finally relax, at least physically. But deep down, a part of her was still scared. What if one day the authorities found them again? What if Okoye's impatience makes him hurt her? Over time, Adaku found herself missing Okoye when he was away. Despite his possessiveness, there were many moments when he was soft with her, gentle touches, words that made her feel wanted. It was confusing, but she knew she was becoming attached to him. At first, Adaku tried to rationalize it. He loves me, she would tell herself. He saved me. But soon, the cracks in their relationship began to show. Okoye's temper was unpredictable. If she questioned him or showed any hint of wanting her own space, he would lash out. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Okoye stared at her, his eyes dark with suspicion. "Why were you talking to the guard for so long today?" he asked, his voice very dangerous. Adaku sighed, tired of his constant accusations. "I was just asking him for water, Okoye. You are being ridiculous." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Okoye's face hardened. "Ridiculous," he repeated, his voice barely above whisper. "Is that what you think of me?" Before she could answer, he grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly. "You belong to me, Adaku. Don't ever forget that." Adaku winced at the pain in her arm but didn't cry out. She had learned by now that showing fear only made things worse. Instead, she stared at him, her heart pounding with both anger and fear. "I haven't forgotten," she said, her voice shaking. Okoye let her go, his eyes softening suddenly, as if he realized he had gone too far. He stepped back, realizing what he had done. "I'm sorry," he said, though his voice was still sharp. "I just don't want to lose you." And just like that, his rage melted away. He reached for her, pulling her into an embrace. "You know I love you, right?" he whispered into her hair. "I only get like this because I care too much and I don't want to lose you." Adaku didn't answer. Her heart was torn. She hated how he controlled her, how he snapped so easily, but at the same time there was something about him she couldn't shake. His intensity made her feel wanted, needed in a way no one else ever had. She was getting used to his overreaction, believing it was his way of showing love. One night, they had gone to a fancy restaurant, and a man had smiled at her politely as they passed. Adaku hadn't thought much of it, but Okoye noticed everything. As soon as they got back to the mansion, his mood shifted. "You liked the way that man looked at you, didn't you?" His hand gripping her wrist. "Okoye, stop. You are overreacting. I didn't even notice him." Adaku snapped, yanking her hand away. She had had enough of his jealousy. For the first time, she raised her voice at him. But instead of backing down, Okoye's face darkened with anger. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You think I don't see how you look at other men when we go out? You think I'm stupid?" Adaku's heart raised. She had never seen him this angry before. "I'm not lying. Why can't you trust me?" she yelled back, her own frustration boiling over. "I haven't done anything wrong, Okoye. This is all in your head." She burst into tears, saying nothing she ever does pleases him. Her words hit Okoye like a punch. For a moment, he looked stunned, and then, just as quickly, his rage melted into something else. "I can't lose you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You are the only thing keeping me together. You are my ride or die. Yes, I've been with other women, but no one knows who I really am behind closed doors." Adaku's anger melted. She had wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he was hurting her. But now, seeing him like this, she felt her heart softening. It was the same cycle of anger, her frustration, and then his vulnerability drawing her back in. She didn't know how to escape it. The next morning,